So hello everybody, welcome to our webinar today. My name's Karen Bowness. I'm the Marketing Manager here at LiveHire, and today I'm the webinar moderator. We're celebrating the launch of LiveHire's onboarding tool, Live Onboard, today. And we're going to be taking a bit of a quick introduction into that. And then we're also going to be talking about the essential guide to employment contracts in 2023. So first off, let's just kick off with our acknowledgement of country. Then I'll introduce our panel to you. We'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today around Australia and the elders past and present. We acknowledge the ongoing connection that Aboriginal people have to this land and recognise Aboriginal people as the original custodians of this land. As I mentioned earlier, we're here to celebrate the launch of Live Onboard, and to do that, we've invited our special legal team, Annika Fleet and Dean Groundwater from WMD Law, who are employment law experts, to talk to you about employment contracts. So hi, Dean and Annika.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. Also with us, we have our Commercial Director for APAC, Zach Beaton. Hi, Zach.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Karen.
And of course, I'm Karen, your webinar moderator. So let's kick off with a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into all the meaty topics. So as usual, everyone will receive a copy of the video recording within 24 hours of today's session ending. So look out for that in your inbox. At the end of the session, you'll be presented with a survey, which we ask you to take time to fill out. It helps us to improve our sessions, gives you the opportunity to suggest topics and also to suggest speakers. If you know someone that's a great speaker that might be good to address our audience, we'd love to know them. And that also gives you the opportunity to ask for more information about LiveHire, or in this case, the people at WMD have a great offer for you. If you'd like to take up that offer, just tick the box on the survey also. Now, our next event, I'm super excited to have the amazing Joel Lalgi, who's known as the Realist Recruiter. You may have seen him on LinkedIn. He's all over LinkedIn and TikTok. He has some amazing content, and I was so thrilled to be able to secure him as a speaker/trainer for our next session. He's going to be doing some social media training for recruiters. He's lots of fun. I invite you to look him up on LinkedIn. He does some great recruitment content that's really different. So that will be on the 11th of October. So keep an eye out on your inboxes for that invitation, which should go out next week. As I mentioned, we're celebrating Live Onboard, our new tool. So we've got some merch to give away as part of the session. So in order to win a t-shirt, all you need to do is be, I guess, a random winner, is just talk to us through the Q&A box and ask questions. We just want you to get the most out of the session today by asking questions. It's not often you get live access to legal experts like Dean and Annika. So make the most of it and ask them all your questions. And to do that, all you need to do is click on this Q&A box and send your question through. And I'll be here helping with any admin ones, and Annika is also on the other end with those. We're doing our format a little bit differently this time. Normally we save questions to the end, but Annika and Dean are going to answer your questions throughout their presentation. So that will be really helpful for you to get your questions answered straight away. But to kick us off and get you practicing using the quick Q&A button, just type in hi to me and let me know what state or whereabouts in that state you're coming from, and I'll award some random winners for our t-shirts. And then again, as you ask questions throughout the sessions, you'll see random winners will come up. If you're a winner, you'll be sent a link to a landing page. So all you have to do is give me your delivery details and your t-shirt size, and I'll make sure you receive that prize. So as I mentioned, our agenda is a little bit different today. We're going to be kicking off first with our bit of an introduction into Live Onboard. Then we're going to pass over to Dean and Annika, who are going to take that really deep dive into employment contracts in 2023. Then at the end, we'll have time for any last minute questions. But as I mentioned, feel free to ask your questions as we go through. Okay, so I'm really excited to pass over to Zach, who's going to go through our Live Onboard tool for you. Thanks, Zach.
Brilliant. Thank you, Karen, and welcome everybody on the line. We absolutely appreciate you guys taking the time to join us today. So before I do hand over to Annika and Dean, we did want to talk about we thought it was a good chance to give you guys a snapshot of LiveHire's new onboarding module, Live Onboard. And we only launched this product about 2 months ago, so it is very, very new. And there's a few reasons that we sort of brought this to market in addition to our CRM and ATS platform. And really the first one is that our clients regularly asked us for further onboarding capabilities with a streamlined kind of flow of data, automated workflows, and really a more robust process to create their employment and their employment contracts, but also then their forms management and capture of data in the onboarding process. And really there's a few ways that, or few reasons or pain points or challenges that we solve as part of this, is that the process is very time consuming in onboarding. It's typically manual or a poor process, which tends to create errors during onboarding as well. I think lack of compliance and increased risk of something going wrong. There's nothing worse than paying your employees incorrectly. And we've seen, multiple examples in the media over the last 12 to 18 months of organizations that have been caught out in that space. Often there's very poor or clunky review and approval processes, lack of automation, the technology stack's not integrated. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is that if it's a really poor onboarding experience, then that's the first impression that your candidate or new employee gets of your organization. So we want to make sure that that's really, really tied up and provide that really positive experience. And so we wanted to extend the capabilities of LiveHire beyond just the selection of candidates. And so we wanted to go into a bit more into that holistic onboarding process. And so at the front end, we have the LiveHire's kind of CRM and ATS, which handles all of the recruitment process from kind of sourcing and attraction, engagement, all the way through the recruitment workflow to a successful candidate. And Live Onboard then really takes over to provide a really robust onboarding experience. So we tackle the contract construction, creation, review of the employment agreement, including that approval process. And then once approved, the platform will send out the offer and any associated documents to the candidate to review, e-sign, and complete that required documentation. So this step's really critical when we're capturing, bank, tax, super details, plus any other policies or information you might need from the candidate or the employee. The next thing is that we have tailored workflows, and that can automate a lot of those onboarding steps as well. So that the employee is ready and set up for day one. So I think, all of those different things that need to happen for an employee to be ready on day one. So whether that's IT setup, whether it's kind of office or security access, maybe it's a uniform order, maybe it's pre-boarding inductions that happen. All of this can be configured and automated to create that personalized journey for the new employee. It's automating a lot of those manual tasks for HR and the hiring manager as well. And I think the key here is that we really want to streamline that onboarding experience. We want to make it easily accessible for the hiring manager, for the employee, for the recruitment and the talent team. And so that everything is easily, it's a one-click download of documentation. We take them through that journey, but the journey doesn't need to finish at day one as well. There's lots of capabilities around, in the first 6 months around probation check-ins, and after 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, what are the things that need to happen so that we can automate some of those experience or those touch points or those moments that matter for an employee when they're starting with us to provide that really, really positive experience. And it's probably obvious, but it's more than just contract creation. And that's a contract creation and ensuring that is, legally, the right documentation, the right clauses, whether it's enterprise agreement, whether it's, awards, whatever it may be. That's really, really important information and an important aspect to get right. And Annika and Dean will take you guys through some of the nuances to that shortly. But all of these other steps in the workflow are really critical to ensuring that compliance, to ensuring the accuracy of information, whilst providing that really positive experience for the candidate. And that's what we're seeing our clients kind of get out of launching Live Onboard by kind of saving time and resources that are normally assigned to, normally assigned to complete these tasks, usually manually, to be honest. Up to 80% of that effort can be saved by launching an onboarding platform like Live Onboard. Ensuring all necessary information is captured with ease, that the contract signing, the completion of relevant forms, bank, tax, super, to make sure that the employee is getting paid correctly and all that information is accurate. That leads us into kind of reducing the risk of something going wrong. Having that audit trail, time and date stamping everything, having approval processes in place to make sure that what's going out to the employee and what's being sent back is accurate and validated. And lastly, and I've touched on this already, is providing that A-grade candidate, recruiter, and hiring manager experience, ensuring everyone's engaged through the process, which typically leads to reduced turnover over time as well. And that's sort of Live Onboard in a snapshot. I didn't want to take up too much of your time with the sales pitch, but no good deed goes unpunished. So I will pass over to Annika and Dean now to take us through all things employment contracts.
Thanks, Zach. It looks like that technology will save so much time and money for employers in their business. So it's a great overview. Well, thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. Our goal is to help our listeners improve their employment contracts and also their workplace policies. So we're really big advocates of getting it right the first time at the beginning of the relationship, rather than having unclear or uncertain terms in a contract that later causes dispute. So throughout the webinar today, you're welcome to ask questions, and I'll be monitoring that here, and we will pause at certain times to answer questions where we can. But if we don't get to the questions as well, we can contact you after the webinar and try to answer that for you. So feel free to ask questions as they might pop up. We'll be talking about a number of issues today that we see in our legal practice. Firstly, we're talking about restraints of trade. We're going to talk about employee confidential information. We're going to talk about intellectual property, flexible work practices, some issues specific to executives, and also some other specific provisions that we see or recommend are included in employment contracts or policies. So our first topic today, we're going to talk about restraints. So there's considerable contention between an employer and employee when the employment relationship comes to an end, which is why we thought it's an important thing that everyone or employers consider at the beginning of the relationship when the contract is formed. So Dean, could you please talk to our viewers and provide some insight about drafting enforceable restraints of trade?
Sure, thanks Annika. And so, yeah, restraints, like some of the other topics we're talking about today, restraints in employment contracts not only assist in the relationship between the employer and the employee, but they have a real impact on the actual performance of the business, both presently and particularly in the future, in terms of protecting the business and protecting its rights. So I understand we have a widely skilled audience today, some very experienced HR practitioners and some that are novices. So we're trying to pitch this presentation somewhere in the middle. So for those of you that don't know what a restraint is, it's a restriction on an employee after their employment ends, and it prevents them from doing certain things that might be harmful to the business. As you probably know, once an employee's termination comes to an end and they move on, unless there's a contractual term that restricts what they do, employees can compete with the business. An employee can set up next door. An employee is completely unrestricted as to what they can do with the information they've gained from your business, and who they pass that on to, what they do with it, and who they work for. But a properly drafted restraint can limit what employees do post-employment and can in that way protect the business. There are two types of clauses. Non-competition clauses prevent an employee from working in your industry, a particular part of your industry, or with competitors. So that's a protection on them actually working for someone for a period of time. A more lenient type of restraint, the non-solicit, non-dealing clauses, which usually are aimed at restricting employees from dealing with your customers or from poaching your employees. It's not that you can just draft any clause into a contract that restricts an employee in any way you like after the employment relationship ends. There's limits to it, and it can only restrict protectable interests. I'm going to go through what they are. And it can be no more than what's reasonable to protect those legitimate interests of the company. When we talk about protectable interests, we're talking about one of your greatest assets, your customers, your goodwill in your customers, those relationships, those clients. So it's important to look in your restraint clause at how you define clients. Is it anyone that you've dealt with for the last 20 years? Is it clients you've dealt with in the past 12 months? Is it a particular group? Is it clients that the employee has formed a relationship with? Prospective clients, people that have just walked in off the street. So a court is going to be less willing to protect your employee from contacting someone that has a very feeble relationship with your company. Someone that has walked in off the street, hasn't done any business with you yet. The next sort of protectable interest are your valuable trade secrets and your confidential information. In terms of a restaurant, it might be your recipes, the secret herbs and spices, as KFC would say. This information is absolutely imperative to your business. Look at Coca-Cola. They've kept their formula secret for decades. And how do we then demonstrate that a restraint was reasonable? How do we know something was reasonable? We look at the relevant knowledge of the employee. What sort of knowledge are they privy to? Were they someone that attended board meetings? Were they someone that attended meetings about the future direction of your business? What do they know? Do they know the formula for your secret sauce? Another factor is, who is the human face of the business? If that person was put out as the person that marketed, that sold your products, what effect would that have if they turn up at one of your competitors? And what is their propensity to solicit customers? So all these things can be taken into account when determining if a restraint is reasonable.
Thanks, Dean. I think it would also be good to talk about how to draft that in an employment contract. So can you talk to our viewers about how to make the restraint reasonable?
Sure. So from a drafting point of view, a lot of you have probably seen, the way these are drafted. Employees can be restrained from doing activities for a particular duration in a particular geographical area. And what's an appropriate geographical area will depend. I mean, if your business operates only in New South Wales, a restraint that restricts an employee from activities in Queensland is over the top and not reasonable. It looks at the activities that you're trying to restrain. So, for example, you can restrain employees from earning an income from your clients, or from contacting your clients for the purpose of enticing them away from your business. But you often see restraints that are drafted so broadly that it just talks about contact with clients. Well, you can't stop an employee from contacting a client that might have been a member of their baseball team. You know, that sort of restraint is too over the top. It has to have that tie to protecting your business. The nature of the industry makes a difference. In professional services, it's often the case that relationships are based on trust, years of confidence, and those sort of relationships. The client or customer and the employee feels more bound to the advisor, to the employee, and would be more likely to follow them. So that makes a difference. The employee's seniority, what they know, that makes a difference. And whether the employee possesses confidential information, that makes a big difference.
I'll just stop there to ask a couple of questions, because we do have some. The first question is from Zagham, and he's asking, how binding are these non-competition clauses? So as an example, he said if someone's an architect and that's all they know, where else can they go besides to another competitor or a similar business? So how binding would it be to stop that architect from going somewhere or to a competitor?
Yeah, look, the non-competition clauses in relation to employees are certainly trickier to draft, and are certainly less binding than the non-contact clauses, which just protect clients. So in an architecture firm example, what's probably more appropriate is a restraint that restricts the architect from contacting clients of the business. A better example of where a non-competition clause would be appropriate would, say, be someone like Alan Joyce from Qantas. So Alan was the face of Qantas. Now, if there was a non-compete clause that prevented Alan Joyce from working in an airline within Australia or Asia Pacific for a reasonable period of time, that sort of competition clause would be enforceable, because how damaging would it be for Qantas? And Qantas would be justified in having a clause that protects its interests, because how difficult would it be for Qantas if we saw Alan Joyce on the television today promoting Virgin Airlines, for example? That would absolutely confuse the market and absolutely damage Qantas's brand. So it depends on all those factors, and probably the Alan Joyce example is a sort of extreme example of where a non-competition clause would be effective and would be binding. But thanks for that question. That's a great question.
And I think that kind of a follow-up, we have a comment here from John who says, I don't believe you can restrain the average worker from leaving and working for a competitor, as it can be seen as restricting their ability to work and earning an income in their chosen career. And that's absolutely correct. It's really difficult to restrain them, but it really depends on the position that they held in the business. Like Dean said, someone like Alan Joyce, or in an executive position, the clauses that seek to restrain them from working elsewhere are more likely to be enforceable than for an average worker, as John had said, trying to stop them doing their chosen career. Like, that's absolutely correct.
I think that's right. Someone that works, in a manufacturing on a production line that doesn't have client contact, that's not privy to confidential processing or information about the product. What would be the harm to the company of that employee working at a competitor? There probably isn't an interest to protect. But thanks for that question.
Our next part of this slide here, it says, what if it's not reasonable? And one of the questions that we have from Adelia that relates to that is saying, are waterfall clauses best practice? And we kind of deal with this here, like, what can you do to in your drafting of the restraints to make sure that it is as enforceable as possible? So is the waterfall clause best practice?
Yeah, so the waterfall clause, or some people call it the cascading clause, you may have seen them. So that's in relation to a time period. It might, in the clause, say 24 months, 12 months, 18 months, 6 months. Now, in New South Wales, these aren't so imperative in drafting, because the court, if a restraint clause is for 24 months, and the court thinks that restraint clause is too long, it can impose what it thinks is reasonable. In other states, if part of that clause is struck out, the clause doesn't operate, and hence, if 24 is found to be too long, the court then looks at the next, is 12 months too long, strikes that out, it gets down to, you know, the next one. So yeah, cascading clauses are imperative, not necessary in New South Wales.
And Dean, have you got a case that you also wanted to talk about, PEC? The case of PEC?
Thanks. I've just got yeah, I'd like to talk about a particular example, which is the case of Just Group and PEC. So in Just Group and PEC, the employee in that case was the CFO of Just Group, and she had a restraint which restrained her for 24 months in Australia and New Zealand, and it had two prongs. It restrained her from working as a competitor for any specialty brand and fashion business. And then the second prong, it prevented her from working in 50 brands that were listed in an annexure to her employment contract. And that included Country Road, Roger David, Giordano, Topshop, and there were a list of 50. And the court looked at and whether it was reasonable to restrain her in that way. And that's where the court did sort of take out the blue pencil, and it decided that some of those 50 so-called competitors weren't legitimate competitors, and it severed those from the restraint. Yeah, so that was interesting, where the court was able to look at the reasonableness of the restraint in terms of those competitors and who were legitimate competitors.
Thanks, Sam. Moving our next topic, we're going to talk about avoiding the misuse of confidential information. And this relates to actually a question that we have. So another question we have here from Sophie says, are HR professionals subject to non-competition given we have access to sensitive information? And I just wanted to talk about that question at this point, because it may be that the HR professional, depending upon their level and skill in the business, they may not be subject to an enforceable non-compete, but if they have sensitive information, that really relates to the confidential information they have in the business, which is our next topic. So, Dean, I'll get you to talk to everyone about why it's important that there are a good, properly drafted confidential information clauses in an agreement, what can be done if confidential information is misused, and what should go into the employment contract to protect the business or to protect the business's confidential information.
Yeah, sure. So again, this is another protection that is between employer and employee, but really does affect the performance of the business, or potentially if we get this wrong and if we don't have a properly drafted confidentiality clause, because, you know, the confidential information can often have, you know, affect competitive advantage. It might be plans for new revenue streams, it might be cost-cutting measures, it might be the implementation of new technology, and all of these things affect the future performance of the business against its competitors. So we don't want that information to get out. And also, a very important piece of confidential information is your client database, you know, your CRM, and we don't want that to come out of the company's hands. So, you know, potentially there's financial loss, there's a financial impact if these sort of things are released. And often once they're released out into the market, it's too late. The damage is done. Even though we have a redress, we can go to court, get injunctions, get damages. It's very hard to calculate the damages on, you know, losing half of your customer database, it's hard to calculate that sort of damage and that sort of impact. So what we should do is take preventative steps in drafting that contract. Have things like taking a sort of confidentiality template and throwing that in isn't enough. It's got to cover the particular confidential pieces of information that are relevant to your business. If you're in design, it might be your particular plans, your CAD CAM. If you're a chef, it might be your recipes. If you're in computer programming, it might be your pieces of software, your pieces of code. So we've got to tailor that confidentiality clause to pick up all the things that we hold confidential and dear to our business. We want a provision in there that requires the return of confidential information or the destruction of any confidential information. This interacts with an internet and email use policy. In our practice, we've so often seen employees who, in their last week of employment, send emails to their private addresses with attachments of databases and documents, and we clearly need a term in the employment contract that says this is not on. And then be careful about our employment, be careful about our confidentiality, keep it to a need to know and restrict access. And on the Coca-Cola example, that company must have been very good at keeping their formula safe and secret because it hasn't got out.
Thanks, Dean. I know in my experience, like I've been acting for businesses that have had a number of issues dealing with or trying to protect their confidential information and restraining employees after they leave. Like in one example I've had recently, the employee left and started contacting clients and offering a lower price for the same services. So not only were they trying to solicit clients, but they were using confidential information from the business to try to offer the clients a lower price. But what ultimately happened was that the clients were going back to the employer saying, can you give me this discounted price now? Because this person is saying they can do things cheaper. And it put the business in a really difficult position in having to cut their prices, causing damage just because of what this employee was doing. So it is really important to just have a good employment contract that a properly drafted one that employees are given at the start, and with proper restraints and preventions against the misuse of confidential information. So the next, we wanted to talk about a case study today, which is a 2022 Court of Appeal case that explored the reasonableness of a restraint, and that's the case of McMurtry and Employsure. Dean, can you tell us about this case?
Yeah, thanks, Annika. Yeah, so in this case, the New South Wales Court of Appeal enforced a restraint on David McMurtry, who was senior manager at Employsure. His contract contained a 12-month restraint. The court did read it down to 9 months. In taking into account what the court looked at, there were some relevant factors, some of the factors we talked about earlier. So they looked at the fact that he was an outbound sales manager. He had contributed to the development of the overall company business strategy. He had been involved in their strategic vision. He was in a senior role. He had 100 reports that reported to him of sales staff. He had access to board meetings. He had access to highly sensitive confidential information about Employsure's businesses. And importantly, he had knowledge of its strengths and weaknesses. And he took a job at one of its competitors, and there was a real concern that he was going to be able to use Employsure's weaknesses to his advantage as in his new role with the competitor. And hence, that's why the court was favourable in enforcing a 9-month restraint. And the court found that he did have knowledge it was hard to say how much knowledge, but he must have had some knowledge that could have helped the competitor, and accordingly the court acted accordingly. So, and I think we've discussed that. It was hard for the court to know how much information about the company he would retain, in 6 months, 9 months, or 12 months, and there was a discussion of that. But it was quite clear that he would retain some of this acquired knowledge.
Thanks, Dean. So our next topic that is closely related to confidential information and restraints is intellectual property. So Dean, can you now tell us how businesses can protect their intellectual property from employee exploitation?
Yeah, so it's important again, and again, another issue that not only affects the relationship between the employer and employee, but can affect the enterprise value of the business. If the business is, has created some intellectual property, an invention, or an add-on to an invention, and that was found to be the property of the employee, and this can have huge implications for the enterprise. As we know, a lot of these, particularly technology startups, can go from being of little value to huge value, exponentially in a short period of time. So, and once that happens, you then don't want to be having an argument about who owns the intellectual property, who has rights in it. You want those to be the rights of the company. So again, it comes back to defining an employee's role, because it's only those inventions in the course of an employee's employment that are owned by the company. So we have to clearly set out what the employee's role is, what is the course of their employment. And then once we do that, then we can see clearly whether intellectual property fits inside it or outside of it. We have a case study, about the development of computer software, and if a computer software programmer at a computer software company, designs something outside of the usual course of their employment, unless there's some provision in the contract that stops it, that would be owned by the employee. In the case of this example, a computer game. In the second example, an engineer, with a properly drafted contract, is working on something, and the next morning has an idea while they're at home. Again, we want that intellectual property to be owned by the company, and for the engineer not to have any rights in it.
Thanks, Dean. So what are the takeaways here?
Define employee roles and make those broad to cover any inventions that they might be creating in those roles. Deal with inventions in the contract, and attribute moral rights in any inventions by the employee to the company.
Yeah. I mean, in my practice, I'm seeing a lot of employment contracts, and I'm finding that sometimes the intellectual property clause will be included, but sometimes they won't be included. And the times that they're not included in the employment contract is generally because the employer doesn't feel that role necessitates the need for, or the employee isn't having much to do with the intellectual property of the business. But where employers can get sometimes caught out is as that employee's role might evolve during their employment relationship, if they're promoted and they don't have that clause in their employment contract in the beginning, and there isn't systems in place to go back to recognise that it should be there, that's sometimes where employers can get caught out if they don't have that intellectual property clause properly drafted in their employment contract. So moving on to our next topic of flexible work practices, which is a really hot topic right now in workplaces, and also combined with the new laws around how employers need to deal with flexible work requests. We thought we would talk today about some of the important reasons why it's good for employers to have good policies in place and procedures around flexible work practices. So Dean, can you talk to us about flexible work practices now?
Yeah, thanks, Annika. Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of you have been dealing with these issues, and again, it's an important issue to get right, particularly for morale and for having a committed workforce. In terms of contractual obligations, you're all probably aware that the starting point for looking at flexible work arrangements is to look at, for those employees subject to an award, is to have a look at the award requirements for the application and for dealing with them. And so any clause in the employment contract has to dovetail with any award and the national employment standards. And once ensure compliance with that, then we want our flexibility clause to be a one-stop shop, so that employees know and importantly, they need to know how their application will be dealt with once it's made. It has to be transparency. They need, the clause should cover the procedure of who the application should be made to, how long they can expect to receive a response, and then there should be perhaps a consulting period if there's an unfavourable response, which might lead to an amendment to the application. And ultimately, if the application is unsuccessful, there needs to be a provision for a document generated which explains why the application was unsuccessful, because you probably all know that these unsuccessful applications are now appealable to Fair Work Australia, and having a document which sets out the reasons for refusal would be very important if litigation ensues. But hopefully with a properly drafted arrangement in the contract avoided.
Thanks, Dean. So we wanted to also talk about issues particular to executives. Executives are in a class of their own, really. They have higher value contracts, they can pose more risk to the business. And so there are specific things that should go into an employment contract for an executive employee rather than other employees. So Dean, can you talk to us about the issues particular to executives? What should be included in those agreements?
Yeah, thanks. As we do deal with a lot of dispute work, the common areas of problems with executive contracts, one is around bonuses, the other is around participation in employee share schemes. So particularly with bonuses, at the end of the relationship, where things have perhaps soured, where you have a employment ending in the middle of a bonus period, you then have those questions about calculation or entitlement. Is the employee entitled to half of the bonus if they leave halfway through the year? How should it be calculated? What if it's based on profit or other KPIs? Have they been achieved? All these things are good questions, and the contract needs to be the source of the answer. Because if when you look at the bonus provision in the contract, if it doesn't answer all of these questions, what's that going to lead to? It will lead to ambiguity, which will lead to dispute, and then you have a disgruntled leaver. Potentially you have litigation, potentially disparagement. They then tell your other members of your workforce that, oh, they're not paying my bonus, or they're ripping me off. All of these things are very negative. So this can all be avoided by giving some thought to the bonus arrangement at the start of the relationship and properly defining it. It's the same with employee share schemes. The issues are similar, but then there's particularly the vesting provisions, where the shares vest some event in the future and that event hasn't passed, or we're only partway towards that event. Well, what happens if the employment relationship comes to an end? And if it's not set out properly in the agreement, there's cause for problems. And again, with all these other issues, it's just about looking to see that they're properly drafted so there's no ambiguity. Travel arrangements is always a good one, where there's some ambiguity, and employee, human nature dictates that someone will want to push the envelope. If it's unsure whether they're entitled to business class travel, that envelope's going to be pushed. So just make it clear to avoid dispute.
We have one question on executive contracts, and that question was, should executive contracts always be fixed term? And I think the answer there is to say, well, it depends on what the business is wanting that executive to do. Sometimes they are fixed term, but please keep in mind the new employment laws that came in this year around fixed term contracts that limit it to a maximum of 2 years. And but often they're open-ended permanent contracts for executives. But it would ultimately be a business decision there as to what role that executive is brought into play.
Yeah, I think with that change in the legislation, it's going to be we're going to be moving away from fixed term contracts. Yeah. Because of that limitation on how long they can be enforced for. So I think going forward, they're not going to be.
Yeah. So our next topic, we wanted to talk about some specific provisions in employment contracts that should be considered to be included. Dean, do you want to talk about some of the specific provisions you would recommend?
Yeah, so look, these are just some sort of miscellaneous things to think about, because a lot of provisions of employment contracts are fairly vanilla, fairly without contention. But here's some issues that there's sometimes contention and dispute. So with personal leave and medical certificates, make that clear in your contract. I mean, you can have a medical certificate requirement even for a part day of leave. Again, it's a matter for the business. Some businesses have mandatory Monday medical certificates to prevent, sort of try and prevent long weekends. But again, if you want to have a policy, have it in the agreement. Purchasing annual leave with work-life balance is becoming more popular. Again, if it's in employment contracts, think about standardising it for employees, because if you allow it for some and not others, that creates angst. Have a very, very clear method of calculating what the purchase price is for the annual leave, and think about having a maximum. If an employee wants to buy 6 months of annual leave, how does that affect the business? So think about having a maximum per annum. Closure periods, again, often cause some distaste, because with limited annual leave, if there's a closure period, particularly if it's around Christmas, New Year, January period where travelling and holidays are expensive, some people don't like to take leave at that period of time, but if they're forced to do it, what's the arrangement? Can people take leave without pay to preserve annual leave? Can they get advanced annual leave? Again, all of these are options. Our advice is to clearly set those out in the employment contract.
Before we finish, I'll just answer. We had a couple of questions around employment policies and how they interact with the employment contract and whether they should be referred to in the employment contract. My comments just on that is that A policy will sit outside the contract, and it has two purposes. It's really a reasonable, it is a written direction of something that is reasonable, you know, such as a procedure to be followed, or some other policy that needs to, you know, be enforced. So it can be referred to in the employment contract, but it can also sit outside the employment contract. The reason for that is just to enable it to be updated from time to time as it's needed. Dean, did you also have any comments on employment policies and how they interact with the employment agreement? Yeah,
look, you can incorporate them by reference into the employment agreement. So they could form part of it, or they could not form part of it. If they were to form part of it, I think the updating could be covered by a provision that, you know, as they're updated, they'll be kept up to date on a website. So I think that could get around that. But yeah, it's really a matter of choice. I think if you want to enforce policies, then they should be incorporated as terms of the employment agreement. And when I say enforce, that would be in terms of, you know, disciplinary action or leading to termination if they weren't followed.
Thanks. So I'm just wrapping up today. We do have a couple of other questions we haven't gotten to, but I just wanted to talk to everyone about our offer today, which is a complimentary review of the restraint provisions in your employment contract templates. So if you would like that to be reviewed, we're happy to look at it and make any suggestions for how that may be improved. So what you'll need to do is at the end of this webinar, there is a survey to complete, and if you tick the box that says that you would like to be contacted by us, someone from WMD, one of our support people, will reach out to you to get the employment contract from you, and Dina and I will be in touch in the coming days or weeks to talk to you about that particular provision in your employment contract as a complimentary offer. You're also
there's no obligation there, because if you send it to us and we can see some room for improvement, we'll let you know. It's up to you what you do with that information. If we look at it and it looks good, then we'll give it a sort of tick of approval, and then at least you know that it's enforceable and it does what you think it does. So yeah, happy to help with that. And
yeah, we're also happy to be contacted by phone or email if you have any questions about any of the content in the webinar, or if you'd like any advice about employment or commercial related matters. And you're also welcome to connect with us on LinkedIn. So thanks everyone, and thank you to LiveHire for hosting us today. And we'll pass you back to Karen to wrap everything up.
Thank you so much, Annika and Dean. That was very comprehensive. I'm sure our audience really enjoyed that. So much covered. I think, as Annika mentioned before, if your question hasn't been answered, we will go back through the recording of the question and answers, and Annika or Dean will be in touch via email with an answer to your question. I think, are there any more questions that you wanted to answer while we're here, Annika? We've got a couple more minutes.
Yeah, thanks for the questions today. They have been good, and yeah, I think, you know, hopefully it's helped others by asking those questions. Hopefully it's helped communicate the message to others, but we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Final option for you to send through your last minute questions. You might have one for Zach on a LiveHire question or our live onboard module.
I think one of the questions was, can we get a copy of this presentation? And yes, it will be circulated to everyone that has registered. That's right.
Yes, that's true. Within 24 hours, we'll send a copy of the link to the recording and also a copy of the presentation. I'll also pop in there Dean and Annika's contact details and links to their LinkedIn profiles if you want to connect with them on LinkedIn. Otherwise, anything else, anything final you'd like to say, Zach, Dean, Annika?
Look, thank you to LiveHire. Thanks, Karen and Zach, and thanks for everyone that's participated. It's been a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. And don't forget, take time to fill out that survey at the end. Tell us if you have any suggestions for content for future webinars or speakers. And again, if you'd like more information from WMD or from LiveHire, just tick the box in the survey. Thanks again for spending your afternoon with us. We've really enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Bye, everyone.
Bye.